The truck was slowing down for the station turnoff when the lion cub appeared, standing firmly in the middle of the road, staring straight at her. It didn't run. It wasn't hostile. It just stood there, trembling but determined, as if saying, "Follow me." And when she did, into the thick thorn brush, she never expected to find a lioness, dying and trapped. The late afternoon sun burned low on the Kalahari horizon, turning the sand to fire and the wind to breathless silence. Elena Morales shifted in her seat, the old Land Cruiser groaning beneath her as she guided it along the cracked red trail. Her shirt clung to her skin, soaked from hours of driving under the unforgiving African sun. She had just finished tracking a herd of elephants whose movement patterns had started to change. Possibly due to water scarcity, maybe something worse. Either way, she was tired, dusty, and ready to return to the outpost. She reached for her canteen, taking a slow sip, then turned up the volume on her radio to send in her final report. Static. Dead air. The signal had been fading for the last hour, and it wasn't unusual out here. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of dry grass and something else, something she couldn't name yet. Then it happened. At first it was just a flicker, golden against the rust-colored ridge. Then it moved. Not a tumbleweed, not a shadow, but something alive. A shape darted across the narrow trail ahead. Elena slammed the brake. The cruiser jolted and skidded to a stop, the tires biting into the gravel. A lion cub stood in the middle of the road. Small, frail, covered in red dust, its legs wobbled as it faced her head-on, chest heaving. It didn't run. It didn't even flinch. Elena leaned forward instinctively. The cub's eyes met hers through the windshield, amber pools wide with something far too complex for a creature so young. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was urgency. She cut the engine. The air went still. Slowly she opened the door and stepped out. Her boots sank slightly into the warm earth as she approached, cautious but calm. "Hey, little one," she murmured, her voice low, steady. "Where's your pride?" The cub didn't move. Then, with surprising grace, it took a few steps forward. Its movements were strained, deliberate. Elena froze when it pressed its small head against her shin. It didn't growl. It didn't scratch. It just leaned there, trembling. Then it let out a soft, broken mewl, a sound not of aggression, but of pleading. She knelt instinctively, heart pounding. Her fingers hovered above its fur but didn't touch. The cub looked up at her one last time, then turned around and began to walk toward the ridge, glancing back with every few steps. Elena hesitated. This was no ordinary encounter. She grabbed her pack, double-checked her emergency supplies, rope, water, flare gun, sat phone with barely a signal, and followed. They moved uphill, the cub always just a few steps ahead, threading through the dry thorn bushes and winding between jagged rocks. Elena swatted at biting flies and ducked under low branches. The terrain was getting rougher. 15 minutes in, the cub stopped. They stood at the edge of a narrow ravine. Below, partially hidden by a curtain of brush, was something Elena didn't immediately see. Until it moved. A faint twitch. A paw. Her breath caught. A lioness lay there, nearly buried in the dust. One of her hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, caught firmly in a steel snare half submerged in the sand. Her ribs stuck out in sharp relief against her golden skin, and her breathing was shallow, labored. Flies swarmed her open wounds. Elena felt a wave of nausea and rage rise in her chest. Poachers. Here. The cub whimpered, running in tight, panicked circles along the rim of the ravine. Elena dropped to her knees, pulled out her binoculars, and assessed from above. The lioness was alive, barely. If she wasn't freed soon, dehydration or infection would kill her. She opened her sat phone and tried calling the rescue station. The call failed. She tried the radio. Static. She cursed under her breath. There were no roads here, no backup. And the sun was starting to set. For a moment, she looked at the cub, its tiny chest rising and falling, eyes locked on hers as if demanding a decision. She had no tool strong enough to break the trap, and even if she did, one wrong move and the lioness could strike out in panic. But doing nothing? That wasn't an option. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a military-grade hydration pack. She slid down the embankment carefully, boots crunching loose rocks, heart thudding in her ears. The cub meowed anxiously, pacing above her. When she reached the bottom, she paused. The lioness opened one eye, cloudy, dim. A weak growl vibrated from deep in her throat. "I'm not here to hurt you," Elena whispered. "You've got someone who really needs you to live." The lioness didn't move. Her body was too broken, too spent. Elena slowly twisted the cap off the hydration tube and let a few drops fall onto the lioness's tongue. At first, nothing. Then, a flicker. The tongue moved. Then again. The cub howled from above. Elena looked up, and for a heartbeat, time stopped. On the far ridge, against the flaming sky, a shape appeared. Then another. Then 3 more. Hyenas. They stood still at first, sniffing the air, their eyes gleaming with feral hunger. The cub turned to face them, fur bristling, a pitiful growl rising from its throat. Elena's pulse surged. She had 1 flare left, 1 warning shot, no rifle, no backup. And the night was coming. She scrambled up the slope, the cub pressing against her side. The hyenas began to move, slow and deliberate, like smoke rolling downhill. They weren't rushing, they were circling. Elena knew this was no longer about wildlife conservation. It was survival for all of them. She raised her flare gun. 1 chance, 1 light in the dark. She looked down at the cub, now pressed against her leg, shaking but unyielding. "I'm with you," she whispered, "all the way." And then she pulled the trigger. The flare screamed into the darkening sky, a burst of red fire cracking above the ridge. For a split second, everything froze. The hyenas halted mid-step, eyes blinking at the sudden light. The cub pressed tighter against Elena's leg, his body trembling, but his gaze locked on the threat with fierce, unwavering defiance. The flare arced and fell behind them, fizzling out as dusk swallowed the last of the daylight. The hyenas retreated into the brush, but only a few yards. They weren't gone, just waiting, watching. Elena's breath came shallow. She kept her arm around the cub's back, fingers digging gently into his dusty fur. It wasn't the first time she'd faced danger in the wild, but this felt different. She wasn't protecting herself. She was the line between life and death for 2 lions who had no one else. She turned her eyes back to the ravine. The lioness hadn't moved. Elena moved quickly now, her instincts in full gear. She grabbed her rope and tied it off to the base of a nearby acacia. The cub followed closely, eyes flicking between her and the shifting shadows where the hyenas had vanished. Her descent into the ravine was rougher this time, rocks loose, footing uncertain, but she didn't care. She had to try again. The lioness lay half-conscious, her breathing now more labored. The trap had dug deeper during the night, cutting through skin and muscle. Elena knelt beside her, taking out her flashlight and inspecting the wound. The metal was rusted and jagged, an illegal snare, homemade and unforgiving. Whoever set this hadn't intended for the animal to survive. Elena pulled out a small vial of antiseptic and her compact trauma kit. She cleaned what she could, though the lioness flinched weakly. The animal was too weak to resist. Elena worked fast, wrapping the exposed areas in clean gauze to slow further infection. Then came the real challenge. The snare. She couldn't break it with her hands. She needed leverage. She looked around the ravine and spotted a flat slab of rock near the base of the wall. She wedged it between the wire and the lioness's leg, tying it off with her rope in a crude pulley. She pulled. Hard. The metal groaned, but held. Again. Harder. Her hands began to shake, muscles burning, sweat dripping into her eyes. But still she pulled. The cub meowed from above, his voice sharp, frantic. One more pull, and the wire snapped with a metallic crack. The lioness let out a guttural moan, her body convulsing. Elena reached forward, cradling her head gently, whispering, "It's okay. It's over. You're free now." The cub bolted down the slope, slipping through the brush and tumbling into the ravine. He rushed to his mother's side, rubbing his head against hers, licking her muzzle with tiny, desperate motions. Elena watched them quietly for a moment, then she turned and climbed out. The light was almost gone now, and the air had cooled. But something still felt wrong. She reached her pack and pulled out the satellite phone again. One bar, barely a signal. She tried connecting to the main ranger station. Nothing. She stood scanning the tree line. And then she saw it. A glint of metal, half buried in the sand, near a bush about 15 yards away. She approached cautiously, hand resting on the flare gun at her hip. It wasn't a weapon, but it could buy her a second if she needed one. She brushed the sand away with her boot. A motion-triggered camera. Camouflaged. Fresh. And not from the Park Service. She crouched, checking the angle of the lens. It was pointed directly at the ravine. Someone had placed this here on purpose. To watch. To monitor the trap. Maybe even to record the suffering. Poachers. Human ones. Nearby. Elena scanned the surrounding terrain again, skin prickling. The presence of illegal activity this deep into the protected zone was rare, but not unheard of. If they were still around, if they saw her trying to free a lion, it could go bad quickly. And she had no backup. She returned to her bag and retrieved a satellite beacon, a last resort emergency signal tied into the International Wildlife Protection System. She flicked it on, then stuffed it deep into the shade beneath the acacia. It would take time, maybe an hour, maybe more. She had to survive until then. Back at the ravine, the lioness had shifted slightly. Her breathing was still weak, but more rhythmic. The cub remained beside her, tail twitching at every sound. Elena didn't want to risk moving them yet, not with the injury, not with the predators nearby. So she began to build. She pulled the canvas from her bag and fashioned a low shelter over the ravine, anchoring it with stones and branches. It wouldn't keep out hyenas or poachers, but it would buy them time and keep the sun off the lioness in the morning. She set a perimeter, old ranger tricks, a line of crushed chili pepper and powdered ammonia she kept in emergency sachets. Not foolproof, but hyenas hated the scent. With any luck, it would buy her a few more hours. She dug a shallow pit and lit a smokeless fire using gel fuel from her emergency pack. Not for warmth, for signal. The smoke would be visible at dawn, if anyone was looking. The cub had curled up near her now, his head resting on her boot. His tiny body trembled with exhaustion, but he refused to sleep. Elena looked down at him and exhaled. "You're braver than most men I know," she whispered. He didn't move, but his tail gave a slow thump. Somewhere in the darkness, a twig snapped. She froze, then another. Close. She grabbed the flare gun and stood, listening. Silence. Then footsteps. Human. Faint, but distinct. Elena backed toward the ravine, her body tense. If they came for the lions, if they were armed, she wouldn't win in a fight, but she'd stall them, somehow. The cub stood beside her, tail low, ears forward, and then, just as suddenly as it came, the ideal sound was gone. The night settled again. She didn't sleep, not even for a second. Instead, she sat beside the cub, one hand resting gently on his back, the other gripping the flare gun, eyes wide open until dawn's first light bled into the Kalahari sky. When the sun finally rose, she saw something that made her breath hitch. Fresh boot prints, not hers, coming from the east and stopping only a few feet from her camp, then vanishing into the scrub. Whoever it was had come close, too close, and walked away. She looked at the cub who now slept against her thigh. Someone had watched them and let them live, for now. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she knew this much. They weren't alone out here, and the real danger hadn't even begun. Morning arrived without relief. The sun rose pale and hard, pressing heat back into the land as if the night had never existed. Elena stood slowly, joints stiff, eyes burning from a sleepless vigil. The camp was quiet. Too quiet. Even the insects seemed to hesitate. The cub stirred at her feet, lifting his head and blinking toward the ravine. Below, the lioness lay where Elena had left her, chest rising and falling in shallow but steady rhythm. She was alive, for now. That fragile truth settled into Elena's chest like a promise she could not afford to break. Elena moved carefully, scanning the perimeter. The boot prints were still there, crisp in the morning light. She crouched and studied them. Deep tread, heavy heel. Not a ranger, not a tourist. Someone who knew how to move unseen. Someone who knew this land well enough to come and go without leaving more than a whisper behind. She straightened, heart tightening. Whoever had watched them last night hadn't acted. That restraint felt more dangerous than aggression. The cub padded toward the ravine edge, releasing a soft, anxious sound. Elena followed, kneeling beside him. She checked the lioness again, pulse weak but present, eyes closed, jaw slack with exhaustion. Elena offered water in slow drops. The lioness swallowed this time, a faint rumble vibrating in her chest. Hope flickered. Then the wind shifted. Elena smelled it before she heard it. Musky, sour, unmistakable. Hyenas. She rose and turned, eyes narrowing. At first, she saw nothing. Then movement, low and deliberate, rippling through the grass beyond the acacias. One shape, then another, then a third. 3 hyenas emerged, heads low, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the ravine. They didn't rush. They never did. They fanned out, testing distance, testing Elena. The cub stepped forward, fur bristling, letting out a thin, defiant growl that sounded far too small for the danger it faced. Elena's chest tightened. She raised the flare gun, but didn't fire. Not yet. She reached into her pack and pulled out a compact air horn, the kind she carried for emergencies. Cheap, loud, reliable. She blasted it once. The sound cracked across the plain, sharp and violent. The hyenas flinched, startled, backing away a few steps. But they didn't run. Elena's mind raced. 3 now meant more later. Hyenas rarely hunted alone, especially with a wounded lioness nearby. This was a probe, a test. Night had passed. Hunger remained. She backed slowly toward the ravine, positioning herself between the cub and the advancing shadows. The cub pressed close to her leg, eyes never leaving the hyenas. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settle fully now. Out here, there was no emergency insurance policy, no safety net, no premium you could pay to make risk disappear. Only judgment, only resolve. The hyenas melted back into the brush, vanishing as quietly as they had appeared. Elena exhaled, slow and controlled. But she didn't relax. She moved quickly, reinforcing the perimeter. She dragged thorny branches into a crude barrier, spreading chili powder again, widening the circle. She reset the beacon and tried the satellite phone. 1 bar. Still nothing. By mid-morning, the heat was punishing. The cub stayed close, never more than a step away, as if tethered to her by something invisible and unbreakable. Elena found herself thinking of strange things, of her father back in Arizona, planning retirement in a house with a quiet porch and reliable health insurance, of how safety always felt like something you could arrange with enough foresight. Out here, there was no planning, only presence. The silence broke again shortly after noon. A low chuckle drifted through the air, then another. Hyenas? This time, 5. They appeared from multiple directions, their bodies lean, their movements confident. One circled wide, testing the barrier. Another sat back on its haunches, head tilted, studying Elena with unsettling intelligence. The cub growled again, louder now, standing squarely in front of the ravine. Elena felt a surge of something sharp and painful in her chest, pride mixed with fear. He was too small, too young, and yet he refused to yield. Elena raised the flare gun and fired. The flare streaked low across the ground, exploding in a burst of white heat and sparks just short of the closest hyena. The pack scattered with snarls and yelps, retreating into the brush once more. But this time, Elena saw it clearly. They were learning. They were measuring her limits. And they would be back. She checked the beacon again, still active, still waiting. Time stretched thin and brittle. Then she noticed something else. Beyond the brush, farther out than before, a shape moved where it shouldn't have. Upright, still, watching. Elena lifted her binoculars, hands steady despite the pounding in her chest. A man stood on the ridge. He wore neutral colors, blending into the land. A rifle rested casually against his shoulder. He didn't aim it. He didn't raise it. He simply watched. Their eyes met across the distance. The man didn't smile, didn't wave. After a long moment, he turned and walked away, disappearing behind the rocks like a mirage. Elena lowered the binoculars slowly. The cub looked up at her, sensing the shift in her body, the tightening of her breath. She knelt and rested her forehead briefly against his dusty head. "I see you," she whispered, to him, to the man, to whatever unseen forces were circling them now. The afternoon dragged on. The lioness slept, breathing shallow but steady. The cub dozed in short bursts, waking at every sound. Elena rationed water carefully, knowing every drop mattered. Out here, water was currency, life itself. As the sun began to dip again, Elena felt the weight of the coming night settle over her shoulders. The hyenas would return. The man might return. And help, real help, was still only a possibility hanging somewhere beyond the horizon. She stood, shoulders squared, flare gun in hand, eyes scanning the lengthening shadows. She had drawn a line, and the wild was gathering on the other side. The heat of late morning was already climbing when Elena peeled off the makeshift bandage from her palm. The gash had reopened during the night. Blood had dried and cracked along the edge of her lifeline, a reminder that her body, too, had been pushed past its limits. But pain had become secondary. There were more pressing things than her own blood. The lioness was alive, but just barely. Her breathing had become shallow again, a faint rasp against the sand. Her paw was still swollen and wrapped, but the wound from the trap had darkened overnight. Elena knew the signs of sepsis. She'd treated enough animals in field medicine to understand what came next. Time was no longer on their side. The cub, as always, stayed close. He didn't sleep much anymore. He paced along the edge of the ravine, his young muscles twitching with each sound that came from the brush. His growls had deepened, still small, but no longer innocent. Elena crouched beside the lioness, wiping away the dust from the corner of her eye. "You're stronger than you look," she whispered, "but you won't survive another night like this." The radio still gave nothing but static. The emergency beacon had sent out its pulse 8 hours ago. If anyone had picked it up, they'd be at least 40 miles out, navigating bad roads and worse terrain. That meant help might not come until late afternoon, or not at all. Elena sat back on her heels and looked at her hands. She had a knife, rope, some antiseptic left, and a dwindling supply of water. Not enough to wait, not enough to run. She looked at the snare again, the jagged steel now loosened, but still biting into the lioness's ankle. It had been partially dismantled the day before, but the inner wire was fused beneath the skin. Any real release would require cutting into live muscle. Field surgery without anesthesia. She glanced at the cub. He sat just above them now, watching in complete silence. She took a breath, steadied her hands, and pulled out her blade. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the lioness, "but this is the only chance you've got." She boiled a small pot of water with the last of the fuel gel and sterilized the blade. Then she cleaned her hands, cleaned the area, and began to cut. The lioness roared in pain, a violent jolt that made Elena recoil, but she pressed forward. Her blade moved slowly, carefully, through the tissue. The lioness tried to thrash, but she had no strength left. The cub darted down the slope, yowling in distress, but Elena waved him back. Blood spilled onto the sand. Hot. Alive. She gritted her teeth and kept going. It took nearly 9 minutes to free the last loop of steel. When she pulled it out, the lioness collapsed completely, her body trembling, then still. Elena fell back, panting, her shirt soaked through with sweat. The cub ran to his mother, licking her face, pressing his head against her neck. And then came the sound that froze her heart. Hyenas. Not one, not two. A pack. They laughed. It echoed through the trees like a sick melody, the cruel rhythm of a predator that enjoyed the chase. Elena grabbed her flare gun. One shot. That was all she had left. She couldn't fire it too soon, not until she knew how close they were. She scrambled up the ridge with her binoculars. She didn't have to search for long, 7 of them, moving in a wide arc. The alpha was massive, with a torn ear and eyes like oil. They were coordinated, experienced, not scavengers, hunters. Their leader's gaze fixed on the ravine, then on the cub standing protectively in front of the lioness. They were here for the week, and they knew how to find them. Elena cursed under her breath and ran back down. "We need to move," she muttered. She looked at the lioness. No way, not in her condition. She wasn't walking anywhere. The cub growled. She faced the slope and saw them now, shadows dancing between trees, eyes gleaming. 2 flanked left, 3 to the right, and the alpha came straight down the center. She raised the flare gun, but before she could fire, something moved across the ridge to her left. Not a hyena. A man. He was tall, lean, dressed in khaki with a long-range rifle slung over one shoulder. His face was obscured by a scarf and sunglasses. He stopped 30 yards out, half in shadow. Elena raised her arm. "Hey, help!" The man didn't respond. He stood still, watching. Then, slowly, he raised his rifle, not toward the hyenas, toward the ravine, toward the lioness. Elena's stomach dropped. "Don't!" she yelled, stepping in front of the lioness and cub. "They're not the enemy!" The man didn't fire. He hesitated, lowered the barrel just slightly. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the brush. Gone. Elena stood stunned, breath shallow. Why had he come? And why had he spared them? But there was no time to wonder. The hyenas advanced. She grabbed the cub and pulled him close, his body vibrating with tension. She backed against the lioness's side, pressing herself between the injured mother and the incoming threat. The alpha growled, a deep guttural sound that cut through the air like thunder. Then he lunged. She fired the flare. The explosion of light and sound shattered the moment. The hyenas scattered, yelping, disoriented. Smoke rolled across the ground. The cub whimpered but stayed beside her. The lioness stirred weakly. Then silence. Elena knelt there, panting, staring into the smoke. And once again, in the shifting shadows, she saw movement. Boot prints, fresh, heading in the same direction as the man. He hadn't vanished. He was circling, and the flare hadn't scared him. She looked down at the cub. "We're being hunted too," she whispered. And the cub, in his silence, seemed to understand. The day wasn't over, and the next night was going to be even worse. The sun hung low, casting long, eerie shadows across the dry terrain. Dust rolled across the ridge like ghost smoke. The flare was gone. The man was gone. But the hyenas, they were still there, hiding just beyond sight, weaving between the acacia trees, patient and calculating. Elena could feel them, smell them. Predators didn't need to rush when the prey couldn't run. She crouched beside the lioness, one hand resting on the cub's narrow back. His heart was pounding through his ribs. Every few seconds he let out a growl that was more squeak than roar, but it came from somewhere real, somewhere deep. The lioness stirred weakly, her paw twitching in the dust. The bleeding had stopped, but her body was limp, her breath shallow. Elena didn't know if she'd make it through another hour. She looked up at the horizon. Still no sign of help. She tapped her satellite beacon again. The light blinked back at her, sending, but no confirmation. She checked the radio one last time. Static. No one was coming. Not yet. Her hands trembled as she packed the last of her supplies. One canteen of water, one flare shell, a dull pocket knife. Not much use in a fight. But she wasn't going to let this end in silence. She stood and scanned the tree line. The alpha hyena stepped out first. He was massive, scarred, his fur dark with patches of age, his eyes locked on hers. Then on the cub. His lips peeled back into a yellow grin. One by one, the others followed. 7 total, forming a crescent. The air stilled. The cub took a step forward. Elena reached to stop him, but froze. Something in the way he moved, tail stiff, ears alert, held her in place. He stood between his mother and the predators, paws planted, a living barrier. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He opened his mouth and let out a roar. It was high-pitched, raw, and broken. But it was a roar. The alpha didn't laugh. He growled low, then surged forward, teeth bared. The cub didn't flinch. He sprang to meet him, a blur of gold and fury. Claws out, fangs snapping, he slammed into the hyena's leg, biting, scratching, a wild mess of movement and sound. The hyena yelped in surprise. Elena moved without thinking. She ran, scooped up the cub mid-scrap, spun around, and dove behind the ravine wall, shielding him with her body. A sharp pain sliced across her shoulder. She didn't know what hit her, claw, thorn, rock, but it didn't matter. She was still breathing. The cub trembled in her arms, tail twitching violently, his small body drenched in adrenaline. He tried to twist free, to go back into the fight. She held him tighter. "No," she gasped. "You've done enough." The hyenas regrouped above, snarling louder now, circling. She reached into her bag, pulled out the last flare, loaded the gun, and aimed. The shot exploded into the dirt, feet from the circling predators. Fire and sand rained down. They scattered briefly, but didn't retreat far. They were learning. The light didn't kill them. The sound didn't burn them. And they were getting braver. She backed away slowly, pressing her back against the lioness. The cub pressed against her chest, still growling. His breath came in shallow bursts, his chest rising and falling with frantic energy. The hyenas came again. Not all at once this time. 2 from the left, 1 from the right. Testing her. Calculated. She threw a rock. They dodged. She fired a warning shot with the flare gun's cracked barrel. It sputtered but still made noise. The pack paused. Then something pierced the air. A shrill cry, louder than anything the cub had made before. Elena turned. The cub was standing again. His legs shook, his fur spiked, but he let out another roar, this one deeper, angrier, and then, before she could stop him, he charged again, straight toward the alpha. The hyena lunged in return, jaws wide, but the cub launched himself at the predator's face, claws raking across snout and eye. Elena moved. She grabbed the flare gun aimed low, and fired into the dirt beneath the hyena's paws. A burst of heat and noise. The alpha howled, blinded by dust and pain. The cub dropped and sprinted back to Elena, legs wobbling. She dropped to her knees, scooped him up again, held him close. "You're insane," she whispered. But brave. Brave doesn't even cover it. The hyenas regrouped once more, circling, closing. One flare gone. One bullet left in the emergency pistol she never thought she'd have to use. Her hand hovered near it. Then, from the horizon, a sound. Engines. The low rumble of diesel tearing through sand. Lights flashed between trees. Dust plumed behind moving trucks. The cavalry had arrived. 2 rescue vehicles burst through the brush, tires throwing dirt, horns blaring. The hyenas froze. The alpha growled once more, but this time it was different. His pack was breaking. 2 turned and fled. Another growled and backed away. The alpha stood his ground a second longer, then barked once, sharply, and vanished into the trees. Gone. Elena collapsed backward, still holding the cub. Her ears rang with the echo of engines, of growls, of heartbeats. The first vehicle stopped hard. Doors flew open. 2 wildlife rangers ran forward with stretchers and medical bags. One of them, a tall woman with a shaved head and mirrored glasses, knelt beside Elena and the cub. "Are you injured?" she asked. "Not enough to matter," Elena breathed. "The lioness, she's in the ravine." The second ranger radioed the team. A vet followed close behind, already pulling out supplies. Another set up a hoist system over the edge. The cub jumped from Elena's arms and ran to the ravine. He meowed desperately, over and over, as they lowered a medic into the pit. "She's alive," the medic called up. "Weak but stable. We've got a shot." The cub circled at the edge, yowling in broken rhythms, like he was trying to tell them to hurry. Elena sat back and watched it all unfold. She had survived. He had survived. And the lioness, against every odd, still had a chance. A ranger came up beside her, offering water. She took it without a word. The bottle was ice cold, blessedly cold. She drank slowly, grateful for the simple things: water, safety, life. The vet climbed out of the ravine, covered in dust and sweat. "She's hanging on," he said, "but barely. We'll have to move her carefully." The team worked quickly, sliding the lioness into a net stretcher, securing her limbs, easing her onto the truck bed. The cub leapt up and pressed his face to hers, nose to nose. Elena watched, the sun now dipping behind the trees. She had seen courage in many forms, on the field, in emergency rooms, even in war zones. But nothing like this. Nothing like a lion cub who begged for help and dared to roar in the face of death. They arrived at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center just after midnight. The drive had been long, silent, broken only by the low hum of the diesel engine and the quiet, rhythmic breaths of the lioness lying still in the back of the truck. The cub refused to leave her side. Even as the headlights illuminated the gates of the facility and the rangers began shouting directions, he stayed pressed against her, his small chest rising and falling with the same exhausted rhythm she carried. Elena climbed down from the passenger side, her body aching from the fight, the run, the hours without sleep. Her arm was still wrapped from the cut she'd taken on the shoulder, but she didn't feel it anymore. Not really? Pain had become a whisper, drowned out by relief. She watched as the vet team rushed forward, moving with calm, practiced precision. Dr. Kira, the center's head veterinarian, gave her a nod and immediately took command. Vitals? Weak but present. Blood loss moderate. Dehydration severe. Possible internal tearing in the hind leg. Sedation level? She hasn't moved in 20 minutes. Good, let's keep her that way. Elena stepped back and gave them space. The cub tried to climb into the stretcher with his mother as they began to lift her out of the vehicle. One of the rangers gently scooped him up, and he squirmed in protest until Elena reached out her arms. The moment she held him again, he stilled. His body relaxed, his nose burying into her collarbone like he had done it all his life. "He's bonded to you," someone murmured. "No," Elena replied, her voice barely a whisper. "He's just remembering who gave him hope." They took the lioness into the surgical bay. The cub was carried into a recovery pen just next door, one with a wide glass wall that faced the room where his mother would be treated. The moment they set him down, he padded straight to the glass, his nose touching it, eyes wide. For hours, he didn't move. Even after the lioness was stabilized and hooked up to fluids and antibiotics, even after the wounds were cleaned and the infected tissue removed, the cub remained at the glass, watching, waiting, protecting. The sun rose over the treetops before Elena allowed herself to rest. She was given a cot in a room above the recovery wing, but sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it came with dreams, of flares, of dust, of dark eyes watching from the brush. She woke to find the cub curled up on the blanket outside her door. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The lioness began to heal faster than anyone expected, stronger each day. She regained movement in her legs, her coat began to regain its golden sheen, and her eyes, those clouded, lifeless eyes, began to follow Elena when she entered the room. She didn't growl, she didn't flinch. She simply watched, quiet, present. The cub grew even faster. His legs thickened with new muscle, his paws now heavy with promise. He was still a cub, still clumsy and wild, but the way he moved had changed. Less frantic, more focused. There was purpose in every bound, every leap. And every time Elena visited, he would greet her with a soft rumble, brushing against her boots, pressing his head to her knee. And always, always, he would check on his mother first. By the 6th week, they were both declared ready. Elena stood at the edge of the transport pen, arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching the final preparations. The truck had been fitted with straw-lined crates and soft lighting designed to reduce stress. Dr. Kira came to stand beside her, holding a clipboard. "They're more than ready," she said. "Their vitals are strong, instincts intact. You gave them a second chance." "I didn't give them anything," Elena replied. "They took it. All I did was stand beside them." The release site was chosen with care, a protected reserve near the northern border, far from roads and poaching zones. The terrain was open and wild, perfect for lions to reclaim their place. They traveled in the cool of early morning, the roads damp with dew, the sky washed with gentle light. When they arrived, the team moved quietly. No flash photography, no loud voices, just the sound of doors unlatching and crates sliding into place. Elena was the one who opened the latch. The lioness stepped out first. She moved slowly, deliberately, her body low to the earth as if testing the memory of freedom beneath her paws. Then she stopped, looked back at the crate, and let out a low sound, somewhere between a grunt and a sigh. The cub followed, no longer tiny, no longer trembling. He bounded out with a grace that hadn't been there before, his head high, tail flicking confidently. He turned to his mother, and they stood together in the golden grass, side by side. Elena watched them from a few feet away. The lioness turned to her, her amber eyes locking onto the woman's. And in that moment, there was no need for language. Everything was there. The dust, the trap, the roar, the cub's scream, the flare, the choice. The lioness stepped forward slowly, stopping just a breath away. Then she lowered her head and pressed it gently to Elena's chest. It was not a threat. It was recognition, gratitude. A final moment between two survivors who had trusted each other when nothing else made sense. Elena didn't move. She placed one hand on the lioness's neck and whispered, "You did good, Mama." The lioness stepped back. The cub came next. He trotted forward, bold and bright, and lifted himself onto his hind legs. He placed his front paws on her ribs, just as he had that first day, standing in the road and begging her to follow. Elena dropped to one knee and rubbed behind his ears. "You're the bravest little heart I've ever known," she said. He licked her cheek once, rough and warm, then turned and sprinted after his mother, who had already begun to disappear into the tall grass. Elena stood and watched them go. They didn't look back, not once. But as the cub reached the ridge, something small fell from his fur, a tiny claw sheath left behind in the grass. Elena bent down, picked it up, and held it in her palm. A parting gift, a piece of the wild. Back at the truck, one of the rangers turned to her. "You ready to go?" She looked at the ridge one last time, where the wind stirred the grass in the shape of two lions long gone. "Yeah," she said softly. "Let's go." As the truck rumbled back toward civilization, Elna slipped the claw into her pocket. She didn't know if she'd ever see them again, but she didn't need to, because somewhere out there a lioness was walking free. And by her side, a cub who once begged for help had learned to roar, and the heart that had melted hers had found its way home.